Okay, let's get started. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. My name's Gary Forster. I'm the CEO here at Publish What You Fund, and I'm going to be leading you through the research for this work stream 2, impact management objectives and theories of change as part of the DFI Transparency Initiative. I'm joined by my colleagues, so Paul James, who has led this research, Farzana Ahmed, who's our project manager, and Sally Paxton, who represents the project in the US. So hopefully this presentation will just be around 15-20 minutes just to get through the main findings. Then we want to open it up for a discussion. If you do have any questions, please use the chat function and we'll pick those up at the end. And I should let you know that this webinar is being recorded from the start so that we can make it available all online. And hopefully you all received the working paper that was produced that goes along with this, this presentation. Okay. So today, just going to do a quick introduction to the project for those of you who aren't familiar, go through the methodology that we used for this second work stream research. We'll then share some of the findings. We'll discuss a bit about what the research is telling us. We'll share our conclusions and then we'll quickly do some next steps and some time for questions and answers. Okay, so the DFI Transparency Initiative, it's a 2.5-year project looking at the use of public money by development finance institutions to meet global development goals. Our objective is to work collaboratively with DFIs and other stakeholders to increase the transparency of DFIs operations and investments. Our approach is evidence-based and multi-stakeholder in 2 main phases. First of all, the research phase, which we're deep into now, and then followed by advocacy. Just a few notes on the presentation today and the research. So for this work stream, the research does not include financial intermediary investments. We took a strategic call to have a separate work stream that will focus on those later in the research so that we can really pay attention. We recognize that financial intermediary investments in many cases are a very large proportion of DFI portfolios, but we also recognize they're unique. We want to give them the attention they deserve. A second note, we have anonymized the results. That is purposeful and it's intended to highlight the opportunity for what we see as sector-wide transparency reform across all DFIs, rather than just institutional reform for individual agencies. So that explains why we've anonymized the results at this phase. And then finally, we understand that in a work stream where we're covering impact, there's a strong argument to be made to say that we should be covering negative impacts as a result of DFI investments. We haven't covered those within this work stream. We have work stream 3, which is just kicking off at the moment, which is focusing on ESG and accountability to communities. And that is taking a deep focus onto the negative impacts of DFI investments. So we won't be covering those here. In terms of the program, we set it up in November 2019, November last year. We're currently, as I say, concluding work stream 2 of what is at the moment 5 research work streams. They're taking approximately 3 months each. And then towards the end of 2021, 2022, we'll have our transparency recommendations to share. The project has an advisory board that oversees and advises. It is chaired by Rob Mosbacher and includes the participants you can see on your screen. So Andrea Ordonez of Southern Voice, Aubrey Hubry from Insider and Africa Expert Network, Elizabeth Boggs-Davidson from SDG Impact, George Ingram from the Brookings Institution, Karen Finkelstein from IFC, Nancy Lee from the Center for Global Development, Paddy Carter from the CDC Group, and Paul O'Brien from Oxfam America. So we're grateful for their participation in their steer. We've since the commencement of the project held 3 project advisory board meetings to share our research and obtain guidance on the way forward. In terms of the work streams, as I say, there are 5. Basic project information is complete, and we've conducted a webinar for that. So there is a webinar on our website, and there is also the working paper that provides the findings in detail. We're currently on impact, or we're just currently bringing to a close the impact management objective theories of change and impact work stream, which is what we're here to talk about today. This will be followed by environmental, social and governance and accountability to communities, which we're just commencing at the moment. The fourth work stream is value of investment, concessionality, mobilization, and the structure of the deal. And the fifth work stream is financial intermediaries, offshore financial centers, and beneficial ownership. So for this impact management work stream, we had to come up with a working definition of development impact. As you know, there are a lot out there. We chose to go at the highest level and use definition, essentially that development impact is a project's intended positive effect. We assess the transparency of development impact measurement, so how transparent are DFIs in telling us how they actually measure impact, disclosure of results, so baseline, midline, endline data, and financial and development additionality for non-sovereign operations, so how that is defined and how that is disclosed. Ultimately, with this work stream, we were looking to answer 4 research questions from the outset. So firstly, do DFIs disclose their approach to development impact measurement? And if so, how? How do impact measurement and disclosure differ for sovereign and non-sovereign operations? To what extent do DFIs disclose ex-ante impact prediction processes and data? And to what extent do DFIs disclose ex-post impact measurement processes and data? So in terms of how we did this, we conducted a desk-based landscape analysis of impact measurement disclosure. We conducted a survey of aggregated data reporting. We had conducted interviews with DFI employees and other development stakeholders, and we had a meeting of the expert working group for this work stream to discuss the landscape analysis, the draft report, identify anything that we've missed, and make amendments from there. The landscape analysis is very much, as I said, it's a survey of available materials on the websites of DFIs at both aggregate, so kind of organizational policy level, but also at the individual project level. And for each of these work streams, we have to develop a framework. So we do that in consultation with members of the expert working group and from other stakeholders. And in this case, the landscape analysis used a framework with 16 categories of information relating to impact. So workstream 2 started in June, and really a lot of the research was undertaken in June and July. We had the expert working group meeting at the end of July, and since then we've been doing some follow-up conversations and amending the research. The expert working group for working group 2 include Alex McGilfrey from CDC Group, Alex Zawani from Global Innovation Fund, Cesar Gamboa from DAR Peru, Laurie Leonard from the US DFC, Nancy Lee from Center for Global Development, Olivia Prentice from the Impact Management Project, Priscilla Boadi from OECD, Sam Attridge from the Overseas Development Institute, and Vitalis Meha from Reality of Aid Africa. So in terms of the DFIs that we looked at, it was a range of bilateral and multilateral DFIs, and within the multilateral, it included their sovereign and non-sovereign portfolios. So one thing I will say is that having concluded the research and having prepared the first drafts of the working paper that's been published, it became very apparent to us that actually for this work stream, as opposed to work stream 1, where the nuance between sovereign and non-sovereign was less of an issue for kind of basic project information, for how impact management is undertaken and disclosed, we recognized that the nuance of sovereign versus non-sovereign was actually causing some problems in comparing the results. So we did split, and you'll see that the report deals with those two separately, and this presentation will also sort of break down the findings for each group. So in terms of the findings, we'll start with sovereign operations. Taken as a whole, there is a greater degree of impact measurement transparency amongst the sovereign operations of multilateral DFIs than there is for the non-sovereign operations of multilateral and bilateral DFIs. And these differences were most pronounced in relation to the disclosure of the processes and results at the project level. So here first, we'll look at the organizational level. So this is the purple section on the left of the chart. This includes elements such as whether the DFI has a clear statement explaining its impact measurement approach, whether it details the impact standards and initiatives it is aligned to, whether it links to external evaluations and provides an organizational theory of change. Now, starting at the most basic level, the first column here illustrates that a third of the multilateral sovereign DFIs that we reviewed don't actually have a statement on their website regarding their approach to impact measurement. Just stopping there for a moment, if we can't see how agencies intend to measure the impact of their investments, then all of the later fields relating to indicators, evaluations, and actual data become somewhat meaningless. A third of the DFIs we reviewed did have what we deemed a satisfactory explanation of their impact measurement process, while the final 3 agencies had a much more limited explanation, which we marked as orange. Now, given the support for standards such as HIPSO and IRIS+, we were surprised by the lack of disclosure as to which of these initiatives DFIs actually subscribe to. You can see from the chart that no one scored green, indicating no clear explanation was provided by any of the DFIs we reviewed. On the whole, external evaluations were relatively easy to find for most DFIs at the organizational or sectoral level. One DFI's sovereign portfolio was not assessed due to the fact that it's relatively new and no projects have been completed, hence the grey boxes you can see on the chart. We were unable to find organizational or sectoral theories of change for any of the multilateral sovereign DFIs that we reviewed. So now moving on to the project level, while project rationales were provided in almost all cases, theories of change explaining how said rationales would result in positive impact were only provided by a few DFIs, and only in one case did we find such theories of change to be clear and satisfactory. For those looking to interrogate the results of DFI investments, this will only be made more difficult by the lack of information we found regarding project level impact measurement processes, project indicators and metrics and definitions. Without this kind of information, it's near impossible to decipher the data, reports and case studies that DFIs produce. So once we get to the project level results section of the analysis, this is the green section on your screens, things get really interesting. So for sovereign portfolios, we see a number of DFIs actually do share baseline, midline and endline data, with some including cost-benefit analysis and project level evaluations. At the same time, though, a number of agencies don't. This suggests a significant opportunity for reforming the sovereign DFI space, encouraging the release of more impact data and aligning standards around definitions and processes to aid comparison and learning. So moving to non-sovereign, where it's quite a different story. So here, of course, we review both multilateral non-sovereign portfolios as well as the portfolios of bilateral DFIs with a purely non-sovereign focus. But in both cases, we found significantly less disclosure around impact than with the sovereign DFIs. So while at the organizational level, we found satisfactory disclosure of how DFIs do impact measurement for most of those we reviewed, at the project level, we found very little information. As our research shows, beyond individual project rationales, you're lucky if you find any impact information at the project level. For example, we found no theories of change, nor explanations of the process by which individual projects would be monitored, leaving stakeholders in the dark as to when and how information might become available. Except for one case, we didn't find information on indicators or the metrics and definitions of those indicators. And with regards to data, we found no baseline, midline, or endline impact data for any of the DFIs we reviewed. The only partial exception to this finding was one DFI which disclosed results of its advisory projects. So given the dearth of information regarding DFI impact processes and data, our team expanded their review to look also at the burgeoning selection of ex-ante tools. Many of these ex-ante impact prediction tools generate some kind of, form of comprehensive project score. These scores are produced prior to the approval of projects and may be updated on the basis of project monitoring during implementation, according to development indicators. Unfortunately, these scores are rarely released publicly. Two notable exceptions to the lack of disclosure of ex-ante scores are the EBRD, which lists its expected transition impact, its ETI, for each of its investments, and CDC, which has recently begun to disclose the Development Impact Grid score for individual investments. In both cases, this marks a greater degree of transparency than is seen from other DFIs. Now, there is some debate regarding the value of disclosing the project scores of ex-ante tools. On the one hand, disclosed scores, when accompanied by an explanation of the tool's processes, offer a level of justification for the investment choices made by DFIs, and ideally screen out projects that are likely to have limited development impact. They also enable useful comparison at project completion. On the other hand, disclosing these scores can be interpreted as providing an institutional assessment of potential clients, which may in turn have, as providing an institutional assessment of potential clients, which may in turn have commercially sensitive implications, e.g. manipulating market valuations. Furthermore, there are questions regarding the intrinsic value of a single metric in accurately predicting the expected development impact for stakeholders. Finally, some believe there is potential that publication could encourage biases towards higher scores within those same ex-ante prediction systems. Now, our view is that effort and energy going into the efforts to improve ex-ante systems has to be balanced with the same level of effort towards improving disclosure of ex-post data, where we see sort of no real movement at the moment. Encouraged by a number of stakeholders, we looked at the quantity and quality and levels of disclosure of aggregated data available. We identified 4 key aspects for reporting disaggregated data that stakeholders said were important. So firstly, they valued the presence of multi-year results to enable sort of contemporaneous comparison. They value attribution of impact. So again, this is where if a DFI is putting a investment into a business of say 20%, there would be a proportionate sort of reporting of results against that investment, rather than taking the results of the entire organization and allocating them, or at least we were looking for some clarity around how that was undertaken, or if DFIs are investing or co-investing with other organizations, how they allocate their impact given those circumstances. Thirdly, stakeholders valued multiple and informative levels of disaggregation. So there was little consistency within and between DFIs on this. So one DFI with the most extensive use of disaggregation reports direct jobs supported at 5 levels of disaggregation. So that's a portfolio, region, country, sector, and gender. And it disaggregates taxes paid at 3 levels, again, portfolio, sector, country. So a really mixed picture in terms of how DFIs were disaggregating their information. And then finally, or fourthly here, stakeholders explained to us how important it was that definitions of indicators and methods used to calculate disaggregated data, or all data really, how important that is to help them understand, and you'll see to help them understand what the numbers are actually showing and how they were calculated. And you'll see in the report that we go into some detail about the kinds of indicators that different DFIs publish most frequently. And again, there's very little consistency between groups on those indicators. So what does the research tell us? In sum, a combination of more project level data, improved aggregate data, and systematic portfolio reviews and evaluations are, in our view, essential for DFIs to adequately demonstrate their development impact. We see a few specific opportunities. So firstly, disclosure of project level ex ante and ex post data, disclosure of information about the underlying impact measurement methodologies. So this, you'll see in the report that we provided a few case studies, one of which was for the Private Infrastructure Development Group and their results monitoring handbook. This is a document that they use to explain to their stakeholders how they undertake their evaluations and monitoring. And we found it extremely useful in helping us understand actually how that DFI goes about thinking about and defining and measuring its impact. And we think there's a lot of room for improvement there on just understanding how DFIs are doing this stuff, even if the data has to come through at a later stage. Thirdly, we think it's important to address the issue of commercial confidentiality. We think that there are practical opportunities to build exceptions for impact data into non-disclosure agreements and into contracts. And we've seen examples of organizations that do that. So we think that's a discussion that we need to have and see what the feasibility of that is to make sure that we can get the impact data that's needed. And then finally, work to improve aggregate data reporting. So using those 4 elements that were highlighted by the stakeholders we spoke to, we think it's feasible to improve the quality of aggregated data to make it more useful. So in terms of conclusions, given the state of DFI impact transparency at the project aggregate and organizational level, it's hard to understand what impact DFIs are trying to achieve, how that will be measured, and whether it was actually accomplished. This is important not only for accountability, but also for learning and for learning between DFIs, learning within DFIs, and also for demonstrating value. I think our research highlights that there is clearly a lot of room for improvement just in bringing all DFIs up to the kind of the highest standards presented here, let alone full transparency. That would be a huge leap forward if we could get everyone to be clear on their methodologies and their indicators and how they share their data, etc. Aggregated data, it's often touted as a solution to the commercial sensitivity problem. If we can aggregate it, we can anonymize it. Actually, upon our investigation, we found it to be of quite limited value at the moment, given all of the issues we've raised around the lack of transparency around the indicators used and the processes used to collect it. We have concerns that if that's where the sector is moving, then work is still going to have to be done to make sure that that data is actually meaningful and understandable. And then finally, coming back to commercial confidentiality, through the interviews we undertook, it became clear from a number of organizations, and this includes DFIs as well as others, that actually, commercial confidentiality should no longer be used as a blanket reason for not sharing impact data, and that the prioritization of impact, early discussions with investees, exceptions clauses in contracts would be sufficient to enable some data to be made publicly available across all DFI investments. And I think that's an exciting opportunity. Again, it's something we need to look into further. There are examples of groups, impact investing groups and others, who already sort of have tackled this issue and have found ways to meet the needs of the client in terms of making sure that not all market sensitive information is disclosed, but have found ways of making sure that there's reporting and publication of the core data that they then use to monitor the impact of their investments. In terms of next steps, we are concluding this work stream. We are open to feedback. We can, make amendments to the research, the working paper that's gone out. And we are currently commencing work stream 3. So that's the environmental and social governance and accountability to communities work stream. So please, look, thank you for listening. Please, there's information on our website. This webinar will be posted there. And do just get in contact with us. We're more than happy to find time to talk to anyone with an interest or experience in this space that could be useful for what we're trying to achieve. Just before I open the questions, Sally or Paul, was there anything that I missed there?
No, thanks.
I don't think so. Thank you.
Okay. So just give me a second. I'm just catching up with the chat. So the first question says, theory of change at institutional level. Have you looked at theory of change? Have you looked for theories of change at country program level? Makes more sense for multi-sectoral organizations and their clients. Paul, can I hand that one over to you, please?
So, I mean, in short, we didn't specifically look for country program level theories of change. We did conduct kind of general searches for theories of change at organizational level and didn't turn up much more than we found anyway, to be honest. But we didn't specify country level. It's something we can maybe revisit.
Thanks, Paul. And maybe we can, maybe we can take a look at that and then put a note in the report to that effect, if we can do something that's rigorous but not too demanding. So we've got a comment here saying IFC does disclose the qualitative anticipated impact measurement and monitoring assessment for each investment. So that's their Exante AIM system. Paul, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, so I guess in the presentation, when we were saying yes or no, that was the publication of the actual metric score, which IFC doesn't disclose. As the comment says, there's a kind of narrative outline of the anticipated impact measurement and monitoring assessment. So and that's correct, you can find that under their database, under their AIM section, but it doesn't include, we were essentially looking for the metric which was produced at the end of it, the overall score, which isn't disclosed.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. We've got a question here. I wasn't clear on whether you examined the availability of interim progress reports. Can you clarify, please? And then also, will you be cataloguing and publishing information on the DFIs valuation documents? I presume that means valuation as in value rather than evaluation, and whether or not they are disclosed. So the first part of that, Paul, interim progress reports.
So we found interim progress reports for a number of sovereign operations in particular, particularly with bilateral DFI investments. That we found none. We found, I mean, in line with the results on actual kind of impact results, we essentially didn't find anything beyond landing pages for projects, so that there were no interim progress reports.
And then on the question of will we be cataloguing and publishing information on the DFIs valuation documents? If that means evaluation, then the answer is no, just because that would be a huge piece of work in and of itself. If it means valuation, as in the financial value or deemed value of investments and companies and so on, then work stream 4, which we're undertaking on the financial structure of deals and so on, will be more likely to deal with that. But if you're asking a bigger question about will we be building any kind of repositories of data and so on, not so much. I think at the moment the approach we're taking to the research, hopefully there's enough links and enough case studies and enough data and examples in the report to be useful for anyone who's interested in any of these elements. But whether or not something like that kind of global database would be a good sort of global public good in the future is probably a question that goes beyond this program. We've got a question here. What root causes did you identify, if any, for why there is an overall lack of transparency? To ask it in a different way, what are the primary impediments to implementation of your recommendations? I'm happy to take that, but Sally, did you want to comment on that?
Sure. I mean, I think there are probably a couple of impediments. One is, is there pressure for more transparency? I think for a long time, there was it just wasn't expected. And I think there has been a movement towards greater transparency. The report acknowledges that. So I do think there needs to be continued pressure. And I think as DFIs look to seek more public resources and more support for the work they're doing, transparency is going to become more and more important, so that there can actually be measurement of what DFIs are trying to do and what they're actually accomplishing. Second of all, I think that the commercial confidentiality is a barrier. I think there are ways that we can chip away at it, as we've seen in this paper and we're seeing with some of the DFIs, but it should not be a blanket reason why there's no disclosure. So I think that's probably the second biggest. And I think one of the things we hope to do with this report is to educate people about our really granular findings to show ways in which we can continue to open up transparency. So that's, I think, the way that getting really granular in terms of our research has been a deliberate choice to make sure that people can really understand the business model, what can be published, what can be made public, and what is truly commercially confidential. So I think that's where we're trying to take the findings of our project.
Yeah. Thanks, Sally. So another question here, what do investors, shareholders think of your emerging conclusions? Are they a target audience for your research? I mean, ultimately, yes. So we know from either shareholders that we've spoken to or ones that we've seen sort of present and talk on the issue of transparency previously, that actually it can be as big a challenge for them in terms of their role as their governance role of DFIs as it is for private investment firms looking to understand what's happening in these places so that they can bring more capital to bear, or accountability groups trying to identify what projects are happening in their areas. So it's definitely of interest. They are a target for our research, and we are reaching out. And so far, folks have been receptive on this because, I think it's a common problem not always being able to get the information you want to identify the impact that the DFI is making. Okay. So we've got okay. So I think we've got I don't know if anyone can see all of these messages or if they're just coming to the panelists, but we've got Issa Faye from IFC saying that he'd like to clarify the position on IFC disclosing its scores. Feel like as a transparency organization, it feels only right that we give Issa the opportunity. Can Issa unmute himself, or do we have to give him that permission?
Yeah, I believe you can give a permission if you go onto attendees and then click on his name. I believe you can.
Okay.
If not, maybe he can just leave an explanation.
No, it's okay. I think okay. You should be able to unmute now, Issa.
Oh.
Yeah, I think we can hear you now.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Sally and Paul, for this job well done. I think that the report adds a lot of value to the landscape of rating and methodologies of DFIs, disclosure practices. No doubt about this. And we are a good supporter. And I think, as you know, IFC supports greater transparency of methodologies, indicators, and results of organizations' impact and monitoring. And we have a record of disclosing impact cases, aggregate ratings, and results outcomes. And this is consistent with our commitment to the impact principle, as you know. So this is where I just wanted to focus. And I have several other comments and suggestions that I would like to discuss separately and send you comments. But I think that in terms of disclosing, we disclose kind of the aggregate rating. What we don't disclose is project by project scores now. And that's not, I think that would be a little bit accurate to just make that nuance, that it's not that we're not disclosing anything, but we are disclosing the aggregate ratings, but not the individual ones. And I think that that's something that I would just want to raise here. And another thing that I would like to say that in the publication, there is a clear emphasis on the publication of the role of the transparency plays in promoting accountability. But the report itself demonstrates the more important objective of learning and improving our methodologies. And for us, this is really important, the learning part and accountability. And it would be good if the authors could really dig a little bit into this issue of how do we foster this feedback loop and devote a little bit more time on that. And this is our ambition in IC also to connect both the ex-ante and the supervision ratings with the ex-post. We need to have a truly end-to-end system. We're not quite yet there. We have started to building the ex-post, but that's what we try to go, because we do believe that the virtue of having an ex-ante disclosure are well taken, but our ambition is really to make the connectivity to the outcome that we deliver on the ground. And I would just say, leave it at that. I have a couple of other comments and suggestions that I will pass on to Paul and the team. But we are truly supportive, and just wanted to clarify that what we are disclosing something. It's not yet what we would like to do, disclose everything, but we disclose at least the aggregate. Just to clarify that on the question.
Thank you, Isa. Thank you very much. So we had another question here. How could the upcoming Financing Commons Summit be used to create more momentum around creating more transparency on impact? I think that's a really good question. I think it's something we're wrestling with. We've reached out to the summit organizers, and we're trying to see what opportunity there is for us to sort of just probably more of an awareness raising and education sort of opportunity at the moment around the research. You know, we note that the Financing Commons Summit is aiming to sort of seek broad agreement on a number of principles, and I think what every DFI is already you know, has already committed to is making a development impact. That's core to their mandate, and I think that what our research hopefully provides is a granular framework that says, okay, well, here's a, you know, and it's not finished, we're not at the recommendation stage, but the frameworks act as a kind of proxy definition for transparency, and it would help development finance institutions, both sort of transnational and national, who will be at the summit, to question, look, how do we measure impact? How do we demonstrate that value that we add? And how can we use these frameworks as a way of sort of auditing our own approach and checking off what we can share and what we can't? I think it's incumbent on all the organizations that will be at the summit to recognize the importance of communicating that value. You know, to Isa's point, the internal learning, etc., is extremely important, but there is a role as well at using this information to externally demonstrate to shareholders and so on that the difference that's being made. So we're still looking for opportunities, and if anyone has any thoughts, then please contact us, and we'd love to use the opportunity to get the message out there, just to raise awareness of this, especially as we've had such great engagement from CSOs, the private sector, and DFIs themselves. This has been a really collaborative effort, and we want to make sure that people are aware that it's going on. We've got a question here. In your research, did you differentiate between DFIs that simply did not have data, stroke information on their impact, and those who had the data but were not willing to share or disclose? This was very difficult to get to the bottom of. Paul, do you want to explain?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I'd say is we were doing desk-based research primarily of transparency. So if the DFI has information but is not disclosing it, then it doesn't meet any requirement for transparency anyway. So for our own analysis, at some point, it's, in terms of actually assessing the transparency, it's a little moot as a point. In terms of whether the data is gathered, I think this is not there's no even answer to it. There's certainly some DFIs which have increased their staffing of impact measurement and understanding impact considerably in recent years. CDC, for example, would stand out as a DFI which have certainly moved resources towards understanding impact, and we're aware that some others don't have the types of resources to do that. So there are certainly examples on both sides where there's data which isn't disclosed but is held, and data which quite possibly DFIs don't have access to themselves.
And I think that this is something I think we'll keep digging into through the course of the project, because you know it's a completely different matter, isn't it? If it's a resource issue, that's a very different matter to a structural commercial confidentiality issue. So if we can really understand and say, look, for for a bilateral DFI, for example, if they had a budget, proportionate to their investments of, X%, then it could, give them the resource they need in order to come up to a base level of impact reporting and collection of data and so on. But at the moment, it has been quite hard to figure that out. I should say that while it's desk-based, this research, we do try and speak with as many DFIs as we can through each work stream, but also we share the data that we've done a non-anonymized version back to the DFI of their own results in order to check whether we've missed anything sort of obvious and so on. So we try and do that, and if we get feedback on that, we do look to amend the working paper, which is kind of the written record of this work. We've got a question here. What does it mean when you indicate in your table of results on sovereign operations that information on additionality is not applicable? How does that differ from a red box? Let's take that one first. Paul, do you want to?
Well, to be honest, this is something we struggled with quite a lot, was that we found additionality statements for non-sovereign operations often. We didn't find them specifically applying to sovereign operations. And our discussions kind of indicated that really additionality as a concept was being thought of by non-sovereign institutions or portfolios. If you take, for example, the multilateral banks, they have a harmonized framework for additionality, but that applies only to their non-sovereign operations. That's not to say that sovereign operations are not additional, or certainly developmentally additional, but perhaps the language used to describe that, or the focus on proving that, is slightly different, or is not present. And because of that, we felt it was perhaps unfair to say that, to mark it as red and say that there was not, that it should be available, but it wasn't found, because a number of our interviews and our expert working group discussion indicated that actually, as a concept, it's more relevant to the non-sovereign side of things.
Thanks, Paul. And then, so then there's a question as well. Do your results suggest that additionality is a concept used by DFIs but not monitored or not disclosed? Which you kind of partly answered, but.
So in terms of the DFIs, I think it's definitely a concept used by them. As I said, the multilaterals have a harmonized framework for it, and most of the bilateral DFIs we surveyed had some approach to it. At some level, we have to kind of note that its additionality is quite a hard concept to prove. There's an expectation on it from the part of shareholders and other stakeholders as well. But there are challenges to prove it, which I think the sector as a whole is working towards. And I think perhaps because of that, the actual disclosure of proof is still quite challenging, I would say is fair to say. For it.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, it doesn't look like we've got any more questions for the time being. Hopefully I haven't missed any. Sally or Paul, is there anything further you wanted to add before I wrap up?
No, except just to say that Issa, I believe we left you off the list of the expert working group for this work stream, so we will modify the PowerPoint and make sure that that is acknowledged. We apologize. Thanks,
Sally. Paul, anything more from yourself? No, okay. So look, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. This webinar will be put on our website along with the working paper for workstream 2. If anyone has any feedback, please send emails, get in contact with us. There is a small window where we can make amendments before we're too embroiled in workstream 3. Hopefully this has been informative. Hopefully the framework and the research that goes with it has provided some sort of granular insight as to the practices or the varied practices of DFIs, and where we think that as a group, as a sector, there is opportunity to reform. So thank you very much for joining us. We'll end it there. Have a good day. Thank you.